Good afternoon. Welcome after coffee break to our second last panel today, a panel entitled Image and Historiosophy, Artistic Reflection on the Subject of History and Remembrance. And my name is Eva Kociszewska, and I work here at the Academy of Fine Arts. And let me introduce our first speaker, Tatiana Tereshchenko, who's currently finishing her PhD entitled The Image of the Other in the Context of Ethnocultural Transformation of Antiquity on the Material of Visual Arts at the St. Petersburg State University. And she has already published several articles on the topic. And she's gonna speak today about Greek vase paintings, polysemantic rethinking of history in the images of the others. Thank you. And please respect our 20 minutes limit.
What is with representation?
Okay, so you can use the arrows or you prefer this one.
Okay.
And here's the pointer.
Okay, thank you. Well, in Greek art, historical events found their visual reflection mainly in sculpture, decorating temples, and in vase painting. In both cases, this rethinking was closely connected with mythology, but sculpture had a very limited number of subjects. For example, mythological battles like these ones, Gigantos, Centaur, Amazonamachy, etc. These scenes might represent real encounters or clashes with other peoples, as for example the Greco-Persian Wars. On the contrary, vase painting, first of all Athenian, was a unique phenomenon of the Greek visual culture, a sort of semiotic system whose elements were closely connected with each other and where a broad circle of important phenomena and values of the Greek culture and world picture were reflected and represented. In the Greek vase painting, a big amount of the others was represented, and each of them was connected with certain historical events and was represented in certain, mainly mythological subjects. These myths, in their turn, interpreted historical events and real contacts with other peoples. One must note that contemporary scholars don't identify these images of others with some peculiar peoples, since they were very imprecise. These images rather represented generalized images of some peoples or groups of peoples, and their names are rather traditional and conventional. The most complicated complex of senses contained images of the so-called Scythians. Their main characteristic traits are high caps, S-shaped arch, and garithus, a case for arrows, and also clothes, shirts and pants or tight bodysuit. Images of Scythians were created between 570 and 470 BC. They were represented in scenes of battles and also in subjects connected with preparation or finishing military activities as companions of Greek warriors, hoplites. Many of these subjects were connected with the Trojan War, and hoplites were Achilles or Paris, characters connected with this war. There is a long discussion regarding their nationality and identification of these characters with real historical figures. Contemporary scholars believe they represent a generalized image of some peoples of northern Black Sea region and or Asia Minor, being attendants of the Greek hoplites. Also, one must admit that today art objects are regarded not as direct illustration of reality, but as a specific medium of conceptualizing some phenomena, problems, etc. Thus, a French scholar, François Lissarac, considers these Scythians as a visual symbol of otherness as a contrast to the identity of the Greek hoplite. Robin Osborne connects these images with discussions about necessity of reforming the Athenian army, seeing them as diminishment of the importance of hoplites, who came from wealthy layers of the Athenian society, and visual call to creating a democratic army recruited from broad layers of society. Indeed, these images existed in the time, and especially their peak was in the time of the peak of the political discussion about the reforming of the army and creating the fleet based on broad democratic circles. Moreover, these images disappear in 480s BC after the end of the reform which democratized the Athenian army and fleet, and also after creating a corps of Athenian archers. In large part, this long discussion is caused by the syncretic and undifferentiated character of these images. They also existed in the epoch which was rich with historical events. In the 570s, BC, there were just a few of them. In the 530s, their number grows. In the 520s, it grows dramatically, almost 10 times. In the 510s, it falls dramatically, about 1.5 times. And in the 500s, it falls even more dramatically, and further on continues falling. Appearance and the dramatic growth of the number of the images of Scythians chronologically coincides with the tyranny of Pisistratus, 560s, 527 BC, with 2 breaks, and expansion of Athens to Peloponnese and the Aegean Islands. The peak of images of Scythians was during the tyranny of Pisistratus' sons, from 527 to 510 BC, and intensification of political struggle between different political groups in Athens, which ended in 507 BC with Cleisthenes coming to power. At the same time, Athens were continuing their expansion to Peloponnese and in the zone of the Turkish Straits, and confrontation between Persia and Greeks of Asia Minor, Peloponnesus, and North Black Sea region was growing. At the same time, Persian Empire was consolidating and strengthening itself, having reached its peak with Darius I. This resulted in its expansion on the west and confrontation with the Greek polis in Asia Minor and also with Scythians. Besides, ethnocultural contacts between Greeks and other peoples at the time were quite intense. At that time finishes the second Greek colonization, and its results are being summed up and comprehended. All this resulted in crystallization of the concept of barbarian. It is also natural that at the time images of diverse others, like Thracians, Phrygians, Blacks, images connected with Egypt and Egyptians appear. So, basing on different versions of interpretation of the images of Scythians, one might conclude that their semiotics has multiple layers. On the most evident one, they are generalized, imprecise images of some peoples of Asia Minor and North Black Sea region. On the level of the subject, these characters are a sort of attribute of subjects connected with the Trojan War and their characters, and mark place of action or identity of some characters like Achilles, Paris, etc. On more general and profound level, in these images, contacts between Greeks and peoples of the North Black Sea region and Asia Minor, and some external events like the expansion of Athens in the Aegean Sea and the growing confrontation with Persia were interpreted. These historical and political contexts might have conditioned popularity of images of Scythians and also Trojan subjects, since they had taken place in Asia Minor and were topical with the challenges of that time. In the end of the 5th century BC, images of Scythians were replaced by those of Persians. To some extent, they were similar, but there were some differences in headdresses, clothes, and weapons. But the main difference was subjects. Persians were represented in scenes of battles with Greeks. These scenes represented the victory of Greeks in the Greco-Persian Wars. Persians appeared in vase painting in the first decade of the 5th century BC with the beginning of these wars, and remained there in the 4th century BC and also in sculpture of the Hellenistic period. Composition of these battles derived from the sense of mythological battles like Gigantor, Centauro, Amazonomachy, and as a rule it was Greek who was represented as stronger and defeating Persian. In addition, in the middle of the 5th century, images represented some peculiar traits of Persian culture appear. First of all, it was their richness, hierarchy, and court life. In the images of blacks, contacts with Africa and their exotic appearance were interpreted. A few of them might be connected, like this one, might be connected with historical events. Thus, a German scientist Buschor suggests that figure vessels with figures of blacks embraced by crocodiles might be connected with the Egyptian military expedition of Greeks during the Greco-Persian War and the defeat of a big group of their troops on a Nile island, Prosopites. Scenes from the myths about Heracles and an Egyptian Tzar Busiris are also traditionally linked with contacts with Egypt and its closeness and hostility towards the foreigners. Indeed, there were quite active and friendly contacts between them and Greeks. Some Egyptian pharaohs of the 6th century BC were even considered as Grecophiles. There also were Greek merchants and their service. Most probably, this myth and its representations are a mixture of different ideas, historical facts, etc. Among them might be a myth about Osiris killed by Set and later resurrected, whose distorted version might be the myths about Heracles and Busiris, or stories about Egyptian killing red-haired foreigners to sacrifice to Osiris, since people with red hair were not numerous about them. In the sum, images of the others in the Greek vase painting constituted a holistic visual cosmology and ethnic world picture where historical events and ethnocultural contexts found their vague and not always clearly differentiated interpretation. They also were a peculiar semiotic environment whose elements obtained their fullest significance in connection with other images. In addition to these high-scale historical events, there was one more semiotic layer in these images. A big amount of phenomena of culture like sacrifice, symposium, way of war, polis, etc. was reflected there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And we're going to proceed to our next paper. And our next speaker, Justyna Balisz-Schmelz, is an art critic and art historian, and she studied art history at the Jagiellonian University and at the Humboldt University in Berlin, and she also studied theater studies in Free University in Berlin. She received her PhD in art history from Jagiellonian University, and she's been still attached to her alma mater. But first of all, she's an assistant professor at the University of Warsaw, and she also collaborates with the Center for Historical Studies of Polish Academy of Science in Berlin. And her main research interests are art and memory, medial aspects of art since 1945, politics, theories and praxis in historical national representations after 1945, and of course, German-Polish art relations. And she's going to speak today about pictures for the fathers, Baselitz Heldenbilder as counter-images of the socialist and fascist body.
Thank you. So I will speak about an artist who could be classified as a West German artist, as a West artist. But I decided to speak about Baselitz because he was born in former East Germany, yes, in Oberlausitz, and he calls himself a cross-border. So in his paintings reflect the conflicted memories of the memory of East and West. And I think it can be detected in these early paintings of him. That's why I focused my analysis on the series of paintings titled Heldenbilder, so the pictures of heroes from 1965 to 1966. And before I do so, I would like to explain why I decided to return to this, I think, well-known and extensively discussed series. It seems that Heldenbilder's exceptionality and insistent relevance rests in the surprising contrast between the simple, almost classical composition, each time with this centrally placed figure of a man in landscape, painted with traditional, or as one would even say, regressive, yes, formal means, figuration plus expressionism, and its really enormous interpretative potential. The multiplicity of formal and thematic references inherent in these pictures creates, at last for me, an extensive semantic layer where carefully weaved autobiographical motifs intermingle with social and political ones. Moreover, all these above-listed aspects converge within the body, which testifies to a truly ingenious instant of the artist's intuition, since his visual arguments would find theoretical confirmation a decade later in the writings of authors such as Michel Foucault and Klaus Teweleit, among others. Significantly, it was only the year 1968 and its events when critical reflections about the body and its various determinants found their first formulations. From that moment on, the body come to be regarded as the locus of power and a space of ideological struggle, and consequently making it the fundamental means for contestation and resistance as well. And all these issues have been already recognized, so I shall not be dwelling on them. But if, on the other hand, we would like to test the current significance of the Baselitz paintings and prove their relevance for culture, for our contemporary culture at large, the answer can be found in the writings of Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht, who examined the immediate aftermath of the war and found in its reality the seed of the climate that lasts till the present day, that is the latency, that permeates the deepest layers of our present. And he also points out this relationship between body and space, and I will come to this issue later. In my view, all this makes Heldenbilder series the peak of the artist's impressive career, a fragment of his oeuvre whose greatness was impossible to match in his later pieces. For this very reason, I was particularly pleased to learn about Georg Baselitz's recent dialogue with Alexander Kluge, inspired by the Heldenbilder exhibition in Frankfurt. The meeting was followed by a publication of Weltveränderter Zorn issued by Zulkamp Verlag, as we see here. Kluge and Baselitz represent the same generation, which Aleida Assmann, drawing on Karl Mannheim's theory of generations, defined as the generation of children of war. And this generational context is important because it shows how the existence, our existence, is embodied, yes, and how it historically anchors each individual life, and especially in Germany, starting with approximately the year the beginning of the 20th century. And this is the generation which constitutes the avant-garde of new forms of commemoration, and we can call this generation the older brothers and sisters of the generation 1968. Both artists concentrate their creative efforts on trying to define their place in history, express the need to rationalize the artist's position within the German society. And in Kluge's reading, Baselitz's heroes are epitomes or the signum temporis, yes, a pars pro toto of the period between 1945 and 1965. And despite the fact that Baselitz does not depict particular people, Kluge finds his figures rather familiar, yet impossible to identify. They are familiar merely in evocative categories, as I would say, as to apply this crucial term now, embodiments of certain rule, as Kluge describes it, in which is their existential foundation. And treating Kluge's remark as a hint, I would like to consider how the convention used by Baselitz could be read as the already mentioned attempt to position oneself, or one's generation, in reference to history. What kind of effect does Baselitz achieve by making his heroes conceptual vehicles of ideologically conflicted post-war reality, an embodied meaning that links retrospection with prospection? Firstly, it seems significant that Baselitz began his work on the Heldenbilder series during his fellowship at the Villa Romana in Florence. We might speculate that his contact with the humanist thought and its aesthetic ideals provoked the artist to reflect both on his own identity as well on the condition of contemporary culture and the image of its human creator. However, Interestingly, in Heldenbilder, Baselitz refers not so much to masterpieces of high Renaissance, but to mannerist artworks. And I think that important reference point here is the book Sozialgeschichte der Kunst und Literatur by Hungarian Marxist art historian Arnold Hauser, who is considering the social circumstances of the production of the artworks. And his book enjoyed a wide readership in Western Germany and constituted a novelty in the country whose art was determined by metaphysically motivated abstraction. And Hauser interpreted mannerism as an artistic expression of the crisis that plagued Western Europe in the 16th century. Now my second reference point are the words of Polish artist and director Tadeusz Kantor, after which he noted after his comeback from Paris in 1947. He writes as follows: the year 1947, a breakthrough. Decisions become radical. The image of man previously considered the only truthful image is gone. I started a cycle of creation anew from scratch. This act of deformation of classic beauty did not take place on a ground of aesthetics. It was the war and the time of the lords of the world that made me and many others lose our faith in this old image with wonderfully formed shapes, as species above all the other species. I remember how reluctant and coldly indifferent I was looking at all these images of human body that cover museum walls, glancing at me innocently as if nothing ever happened. And curiously maybe, Kantor's statement was written more or less at the same time when Germany, plagued by the post-war crisis of representation, witnessed the debate about human images. The debate was sparkled, among others, by the 1948 publication by Austrian art historian Hans Seldmayr, Verlust der Mitte, so Lost of the Center, which was an uncompromising cultural critique written from the Catholic conservative standpoint, somewhat invested with fascist sentiments. Seldmayr identifies the titular loss of the center with this cultural dismissal of the image of man understood as a reflection of the image of God, which he interprets as a symptom and symbol of modernity's crisis of values and its apparent disregard and disrespect for the entire human race. And the peak of this discussion came with the public debate that took place at the Darmstädter Kunsthalle in September 1950. Moreover, the debate was accompanied by an art exhibition showcased under the telling title Das Menschenbild in unserer Zeit, the image of man in our times. And Hans Belting suggests that this debate about the human image was merely a pretext for a new discussion about the urgent problems with the definition of culture, as well as for the issue of what form was adequate for its products made after the wartime of barbarity. Is culture in any sense capable of reinvigorating this annihilated image of man, asks Belting, yet leaves the question open. In the light of the ubiquitous cultural pessimism shared by many contemporary thinkers, we should read Belting's question as an expression of a further-reaching doubts about the possibility of the ideas of humanism being reborn after the war. And here is a quote from Heidegger's low-spirited letter on humanism, where he asks how to give meaning to the word humanism. This question proceeds from your intention to retain the word humanism. I wonder whether this is necessary, or is the damage caused by all such terms still not sufficiently obvious? The Darmstadt debate marks the final moment of the Manichaean clash of different visions of art in post-war Germany. In the West, figurative painting could soon disappear almost completely. The human figure was disembodied and reduced to the spiritual dimension, where in the East, ideologically driven realism serves to illustrate the party slogans, including the production of model representation of the prototype of the new man. And here in 1956 at East Berlin Hochschule für Bildende Künste, Berlin-Weißensee, Hans-Georg Kern, aka Baselitz, begins his studies. On 15th November 1952, in Neues Deutschland, publishes an article by Walter Besenbruch, where the author recounts resolution of the 19th proceedings of the Communist Party of Soviet Union, including the speech of the first secretary of the Socialist Unity Party of Germany, Walter Ulbricht, where he specified the party's guideline regarding the typicality of art. This text defined the notion of realism and the characteristic of a new, positive hero. According to these formulations, realism means not so much the faithful representation of the superficial image of things, but the actual representation that is such that it provides a reflection of the rightful ideology, the ideology of the party. Truth should be reflected in art in a canonized form, whose manifestation is the rule of typicality. Typical is not what is most common. Typical is not something ordinary, but a prefiguration of the normative shaping of the being. A positive hero is not an embodiment of an actual person, but represents the catalogue of the perfect qualities. The series of Baselitz paintings was firstly titled The New Types, and it was in the 70s, it was for the first time exhibited under the title Heroes. After Baselitz was dismissed from the Academy for socio-political immaturity, he left Berlin in 1957. And the date, 1957, is also of great importance because in this year, the relatively liberal Johannes Becher, he was the Minister of Culture, was elegantly removed from the political scene, supplanted by the apostle of ideological orthodoxy, Alfred Kurella. And Kurella's arguments on culture drew extensively on the theories of Entartung. It is possible, therefore, that his intellectual development was influenced by the writings of his father, the psychologist Hans Kurella, who wrote under the impact of Cesare Lombroso, the same whose concepts were adapted by Max Nordau. Kurella wrote articles in which he addressed the issues of body and soul, and in one of these articles we can read, "We should not practice the propaganda of souls, but create such bodies where the soul can find his home." And it seems that in the project of the new man fully manifests itself the totalitarian nature of these two systems, yes, communism and Nazism. Both regimes strove not so much to represent a real body, but its constructed image, which suggested the way it was to be perceived. Both made the distinction between reality and truth, where art was meant to serve rather truth than reality, where the truth was defined by the party and its forcefully implemented ideology. And as we know, much like communist propaganda, here was a picture, okay. Much like communist propaganda, the Nazi propaganda sought to represent types, exemplary features of Germans, rather than images of particular individuals. The Third Reich creates an ideal of the Aryan body, yes, and individual bodies serve to create the collective body, Volkskörper, which, as Bas Naumann persuasively shows, should be understood in terms of an actual being rather than a metaphor. And the ontology of the Volkskörper was based on the construction of opposite identities, where the other, the Jew, was the vehicle of the Fremdskörper. So the racial difference was embodied. Moreover, the Aryan body was the carrier of the culture, which required its biological and sexual aspect to be set aside and made invisible. In his essay, The Dry and the Wet, which the author first intended to call the anatomy of the fascist discourse, Jonathan Litter writes, "Nudity has no ambiguity. The fascist works relentlessly on his body to clean it from all the wetness that comes to be seen as political swamp or erotic decay." So sexuality and perversion are qualities ascribed to the other. All those efforts were taken, and were actually taken, to conceal one fundamental cruel truth, that in fact the major objective and effort of war is that it leaves wants, that it is literally the transformation by burning, destruction, chopping, cutting of human issues. It is not the ecstatic elation experienced when the enemy is defeated, but the bitter and painful reality of the suffering, wounded, torn, or handicapped and deformed body, which is the fundamental experience of the participants of the armed conflicts. And after the war, the misshapen bodies of veterans posed a serious social problem, as well as constituted a permanent cultural phenomena of the post-war landscape, epitomized by the figure of the Heimkehrer, coming back from the front in Iraq. And I show here this picture because the striking accessory of Baselitz heroes are shoes, or on the contrary, the lack of them. And according to Viktor Golanj, the author of a collection of essays titled In Darkest Germany, published in 1947, the misery of boots is the quintessence of the situation that beset German society in the aftermath of the war. And this symbol gains the further currency when we recall that Nazism, boots worked as one of the most distinct fetishes, which according to the rule of this binary logic of the Nazi outlook could be contrasted with the Jewish dirty and shoeless feet featured in propaganda materials as a proof of the other's insufficient hygiene. Soon the image of the Heimkehrer in Germany was replaced with its positive pendant in the form of a Trümmerfrauen, so the women of the ruins. And they could be made to work as a symbols of a new positive renewal, because the experience of the war by women was quite different as this by experience by men. And these images filled the representational void, yes, that remained after this dismissal of the military images of National Socialism. And in this optic, the much criticized male centricism of the Baselitz pictures, as it was defined by the feminist critics, suddenly gained a much nuanced meaning. So it seems then that with his seemingly random remark that although figures in Baselitz paintings are not portraits of particular people, yet still they exist as a rule, which finds its equivalent in reality, Kluge identified the crucial aspect. Baselitz appropriates the mode of representation of totalitarian states, as suggested by titles such as Der neue Typ, at once deconstructing it. By investing his heroes with all the features associated with otherness, he constructs them as a perfect antithesis of the fascist and socialist bodies. His anti-hero is somehow alien to himself, his body is out of control, becoming its own other. Wet, undisciplined, monstrous, grotesque, sexual, disarmed, alienated from the unity of the collective, which cannot be simply rejected with race or class-based sense of superiority, but needs to be taken into account. And do I have time? 1 minute. Okay, so just one issue. In the portraits of Cinquecento, the landscape was supposed to reflect the harmony of man with nature in accordance with the humanist vision of the world. And in totalitarian regimes, it served to represent social conditions in which the body of the new man was produced. In Baselitz's works, on the other hand, landscape co-creates the panorama of the post-war material, mental, and spiritual renation. And if we take into account that there exists a feedback between corporal and cultural structures, is to invest man with given structure, first the word had to be constructed, and vice versa. We can say that the pictures from Heldenbilder series are thus both reflections on the condition humana as well as complex meditation on the condition humanitas. And to close this with a remark by Alexander Kluge once again. Kluge describes Baselitz's painting Der Soldat. Here is the painting, also from the year 1965, in the following way. No soldier nor warrior is merely a man. An opening in his uniform reveals a fragment of his chest. Parts of his organs are trapped under the helmet. everything is too complicated to manage it. And under the semblance of this multi-layered meaning, then the pictures of Baselitz, at least for me, seem to carry a fundamental message that, to paraphrase Kluge, everything is too complex to be enclosed within one unifying corset or this or other regime without consequences. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. And I invite our third speaker, Dorota Kownacka. She's an art historian, currently adjunct in Institute of Art, Polish Academy of Science. And she studied art history at the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań and the Humboldt University in Berlin. And she also graduated in applied linguistics in Poznań. And the title of her talk, it's pretty complicated. I hope I'm going to get it right. It's Against Illusion, Abstraction Towards the Reality. Kuno, Raeber, Material Thorn, Karl, Rössing, Woods and Linocut, and the War Experience Aspect.
Thank you very much. This what you see is Karl Rössing's woodcut from a cycle Apocalypse from 1946-47. I will show you a few of these during this presentation. Raeber's attitude to art. Kuno Raeber, a Swiss lyrical poet, writer, and novelist, born 1922, died 1992, author of many reviews, by many regarded as a great stranger because of his indemonstrable oeuvre, first recently and gradually discovered by a wider audience, contemplated art and its role in a modern world. Born in Switzerland, settled in Mainz, a brilliant historian and political thinker, upholder of a South Europe culture. Quote, though undeniably conditioned by his native country, he is preoccupied with the destiny of Germany and even more with that of Europe. He is convinced that the Europeans are doomed unless they create a United States of Europe. End of quote. He also came to the origin of the old continent. And second quote. He is not particularly fond of modern Western technology and industrialism. His mind and his heart go out to the Mediterranean countries, especially Italy, southern Italy, Sicily, and Greece. His true spiritual home is, despite his Roman Catholic background, the Mediterranean civilization of antiquity, and he is on the intimate terms with ancient Greek mythology. End of quote. He was pessimist and realist as well, aware of myth, history, and common culture, focused on differences between seeing, writing, and thinking, timeless to some extent visible, but in its nature invisible matter. Material turn. His main interest was concentrated on the artistic expression and celebration, the power of poetic creation. He intended to work out the special language which enables to submit consistency and variability of the object's meaning and appeals to an inviolable element of the eternal thought hidden in the material construction. He tried to discover how artists succeed in working out a real compromise between illusion, abstraction, material, and history. He discovered that it is possible only beyond the object but within its origin. He took note that may suggest he managed to create a logical and factual world as conceptual model of material world. 1956 he wrote, quote, art, literature, that is freedom, impudence, frivolity, daring, prudential game with the endless world of matter, end of quote. Then he confessed once, for me poetry is a masquerade where there is no unmasking but only the trying on ever new masks, end of quote. These two short sentences refer to a very important idea in Raeber's theory of art, memory. Things are never the same because thoughts are never the same. Nevertheless, there must be something that cares for continuum, even if it is inarticulate in human language, and it remains only as a characteristic of material world. Meanings are always influenced by the present moment, by culture, place, and individual experience, so the real meaning doesn't exist. One cannot reveal the true face because everything is open-ended and it's another mask that opens space for another remark. Raeber's main interests refer to potential of material and its natural ability to accumulate meanings organic in its structure, somewhere beyond the storyline, and keeping them in undisturbed vacuum as repository of form untouched by external circumstances. One used to say that he is a poet through and through. Even his stories, his novels, and his essays are fundamentally poems in prose. Those poems in prose offer the material turn that should be compared with iconic or pictorial turn as well. Because they didn't present illusion, storyline with the inner truth of narration, but due to open structure allowed a constructive chaos. Most of all his poems, but also his narrative, are laconic. We may read such characteristic of his writing formulated in a volume Willkommen und Abschied Studies in German Literature, Linguistics and Culture in 2005. The body of Conor Raeber's poetry shows constancy as well as development. The earlier poems tend to be more narrative, ornamental, emotional, and regular. The later ones, according to the author himself, show their objects as the shadow of the wall in Plato's cave, reduced to the basic form, simplified to such an extent that one may deplore the absence of richness, color, and corporalness. End of quote. In these circumstances, the material becomes material than its interpretation. He also emphasized, the language interests me only as a material. Degradation of material. George D. Huberman, his essay about aesthetics of the release and materialist order, discerned that regardless of the philosophy that one would choose, Platonic or Kantian, the material permanently stays in the opposition with other value, matter or form, and it always subordinates to them as a passive and secondary factor. He also emphasized that the material is often considered globally, so very abstract without any specification, which George Bataille, 1929, called idealism of matter. Vasari represented the opinion that material is submitted to the idea, Panofsky as well. Then D.D. Huberman examined the history of Vase, as Aristotle used to show its usefulness, variety of forms, ways of interpretations. His main conclusion was, in material is hidden its destiny, so it's more appropriate for some aims and for some reason cannot be used by other circumstances without being misused. Last but not least, it must exist something that one may call material memory. On the one hand, the material is obedient and tractable, but on the other hand, shows an allegiance, and in the end, it is its strength and its potential. Gottfried Böhm ascertained, following Heidegger's idea of art, that, quote, artists always knew that their work doesn't consist in using certain material, but in bringing out its own language, end of quote. Against illusion toward the reality. By using old pattern basing on memory schemes, artists created a new pictorial language suitable and appropriate for experience of war. This potential of material unable to develop a narration hidden archaic in its texture, which may be compared with crystal constructions created and used by Paul Klee, or in a little different way interpreted by Wilhelm Wöhringer. Klee noted in his diary in 1915 following observation. In a grade down bottom lay rubble. They give a material for abstraction. In a crackled space are all those false elements to create impure crystal. Klee achieved what he was seeking for years, presentation of world view in an alienated form reduced to the external forms. The interpretation follows, quote, by Klee it is possible to understand this metaphor as arising, becoming crusted, as transformation of self-perception in inorganic crystal as planting. Crystal is obviously, which lays in the origin of over 100 years, familiar to art symbol. Wilhelm Wöhringer instead, in the book Abstraction and Empathy, Abstraction und Einfühlung, declared crystal became an aesthetic idiom of abstraction. Abstraction is for Wöhringer an incantation against the human dependence on the external world and release from the life dependency. Abstraction is absolute form and represents the absolute as such. Klee's argumentation was similar to this of Wöhringer. Klee created explicit his conception of crystal first after the impression of the First World War, although he emphasized that war didn't involve him. But for Klee, in opposite to Wöhringer, crystal is a symbol of art and the symbol of its own as well. And another interpretation. Crystal brings out an association with the idea of transparency, which relegates to the clarity and explicitness, and so that figuratively to knowledge, understanding, and conception. In this, it is the idea of pre-existence, origin, and root, cosmos arising from chaos. The Platonic vision of eternal idea assumes that the flesh appeared after spirit, which would be crucial by setting the sequence of inner order lines which predates existence of object, in this case visual work of art. Raeber was following the influence of material on artists. He discovered specific programs from external pieces of work, so-called Außenbilder, to spiritual non-material pieces of work, Seelenbilder, such as soul figment of the imagination. Like Hans Belting, who believed the body is the only space where the inner and outward pictures may meet. Between those two extremities is located aspiration for non-illusion presentation of truth experience, which is based on deconstruction of the object and its meaning and reconstruction suitable for new world condition. The power of hidden value occurring already in the structure of material. The authentically affected work of art is always to some extent uncompleted and indicates hidden basic of cognition. Short-term memory replaced by perspective vision enable the artist to stand clear for the object to comprehend the essence in its structure. In this pure recognition is no longer any place for illusion. Too close to recognize the object. Kuno Raeber, hoping for unification in an object, devoted one of his essays to Karl Rössing's art, especially to this wood and Linocut experience. Karl Rössing, in 1920s and after 1945, developed very inventive method of juxtaposition of opposite elements of a picture, natural with artificial ones adopted from different cultures over centuries, so-called the principle of combinatorics, das Prinzip des Kombinatorischen. He didn't intend to disconcert the audience as Surrealists did, but he wanted to open variety of levels of cognition and interpretations which take place in untouched spaces. He also didn't intend to, in his later work, to create a reconstructed world of concept and new reality, as neue Sachlichkeit. So he managed to create some operation field for war experiences. In Kuno Raeber's opinion, it is an attempt to concentrate an illusion by very haptic, material, and rough attitude to a potential subject, presentation of phenomena hidden behind the current stand. It is like an object without an object. Raeber used to say, quote, "Art is always memory. The memory absolute is it. The more absolute it is, the clearer is this moment. Only an evocation of the known things arises something new. It has its reason. As soon as the abstract art loses its first astonishment, begins to be boring. It is like a play with form and color, which is admittedly illuminating but empty and may be very amusing for an eye and satisfactorily for sophisticated feeling for art. That is why it means nothing. The abstract art, important as reflection of pure structure, was never a temptation for Karl Rössing because it contained too little Weltstoff, word, matter, or fabric." End of quote. Raeber mentioned once that the critic and skepticism are overcome. They are replaced by wisdom. The wisdom, however, doesn't contain any tint of resignation. Late Rössing reached the point, while without disclosing him from a world, he discovered its essential nature. End of quote. Raeber explains that the former artist has seen his own presence from too close perspective, and as soon as he stepped back from the objects in their essence, he managed to comprehend them in their structures. The transition from wood to Linocut by Karl Rössing is for Raeber crucial in the maturation process. As a young artist, Rössing acted against his time. He created a cycle, prejudice or against my current time. But he produced at the time external works, so Außenbilder, inspired by external circumstances. and it belongs to those. I may show you more of this, if I can. Moment. Okay, something like that. This one. Oh, okay. And so Linocut. First in 1950, with starting Linocut period, managed to take distance from all outside. Raeber talks about woodcut realism. In this material and technique that determine very haptic, maybe I will be back here. That determine very haptic and deep work about the origin of things, with sharp edges and deep shadow, like trench and fight for shape, that the presented word should get. The possibility of understanding of all those factors relegates the truth hidden in the structure. It is only a history that enables interpretation abuse. By Linocut, the observer is given a surface with some marks on it, so he can follow the display of art. Sorry. Okay. One should resign from the present meaning of phenomena because of post-war ineffectiveness of the object. Raeber noticed that the artists intend no longer to present objects in their common form. He would rather rebuild them, and the experience of new condition of objects should respond to the new world. Quote, "It is an artistic process. The familiar figures, detached from their classical fixation, gain a new freedom by being set back in their archaic context, where everything is still undetermined, still flowing is easy and ambiguous. It is a new freedom. The observer of the pictures realized that the things which he had met many times and affirmed clichés are hidden in his soul. The art of Karl Rössing, even if it cites classical and therefore untouchable symbols, is due to its procedure anti-classical. It is an art of association in the sense of psychoanalysis. This also implies that the transmitted signs are combined with objects of modern technical civilization, which references the social and political process of the present." End of quote. Raeber concentrated his characterizations on simple remarks, called things directly. I will show you more of this. Sorry. So we may see all. Okay, I wanted this. Fahrrad im Schnee, also bicycle in snow. The bike is lying next to Sphinx torso. The observer should only understand an uncomplicated picture message. Everything is real, that is why it doesn't evoke any illusion. There is no place for perspective or any other elements of composition. It should be unreal, in opposite to multidimensional piece of work referring to the origins and former events. Rössing reminded by the ancient culture, and it's quote, "The artistic legacy of the antiquity of Mediterranean art is reminiscent of our memory as a gold mummy, which will break into dust and the slightest movement, and this dust contains magic ingredients. There is no other substance of such delicacy, of such quality. This magic power of ancient time let Rössing continue the eternal work. Rössing seemed to be naive, but was a wise man as well, who managed to return to the origin, not to the intellectual value, but to the pre-existence vision." Raeber noticed that Rössing made use of motifs many times. Some of them appeared as dreams, like wings, butterfly, female statue, sphinx, winged lion with female head, animal, half man, half bird. Raeber interprets those motifs as responsible for liberation from the material limitations, pressure of stones and walls, statues, torsos, which are always reminiscent of overcoming, primating, shaping, and penetrating. The death is meant as transfiguration. At the end of the essay Raeber wrote that Rössing works of art based on confrontation and struggle, reunification, and reconciliation. That is the particularity of these pictures, they double-faced, once frightening, once delightful. Raeber ascertained that there is no possibility of retreat because there is a crack in world monument that can't be repaired or closed anymore, but the despair in Rössing's work offer hope and works offer hope and remedy, so one should only capture it. End of quote. One may say the remedy is permanent memory of material. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all speakers for perfectly timed presentations. And now we have our last paper by Roma Sendyka, and she's an assistant professor at the Center for Anthropology of Literature and Culture Studies at the Jagiellonian University, and she's also a head of the Research Center for Memory Cultures and founder of the Curatorial Collective in Krakow. And I will not read about all her achievements and publications. I would just say that she's now a leader of two research projects, Unmemorized Genocide Site and the Influence on Contemporary Formation of Collective Memory and Cultural Identity in Poland, and another research project on awkward objects of genocide, vernacular art on the Holocaust and ethnographic museums. And this is within Horizon 2020. And currently she prepares the book entitled Non-Site and the Non-Memory, and I believe her presentation has something to do, maybe, with this, and it's entitled Hobbled Images as Memorial Documents for Underrepresented Events, Regaining Past Through Reading the Affective and Recognizing the Precursory.
Good afternoon, and thank you for invitation for this great event. And I must say I'm really stressed speaking after such splendid talks. A truly art historian tackling on images in a very genuine way. What I would like to propose today is slightly different, since I'm coming from a field of memory culture and culture studies, visual culture studies. So I'm using images to ask questions about culture and external events, phenomena external to the world of art history. So what I would like to talk about today comes from my research on dispersed Holocaust and unmemorialized genocide sites. Part of my research is to ask if it is possible to approach to the history of those, or to approach the events of those random killings represented today by abandoned, overgrown sites of trauma, if we can approach the history and the event through images. And looking for instances of such images, it turned out that there are very few of them. So from this position, I formed a hypothesis that probably it's self-explanatory in a way that, of course, some events of Second World War are less represented via images than others, especially those events that happened rapidly concerning population less exposed to visual arts or involving cutting off prisoners from simplest documenting devices, especially the events of so-called decentered Holocaust, of random shootings, executions, violence in small provincial ghettos, Einsatzgruppen mass killings from 41-43 on the Eastern Front, deaths during transports organized within frames of Reinhardt action, and the death marches at the end of the war are not as intensively visualized as other instances of wartime violence. And of course, if there is enough research done by historians showing now this extended interest in dispersed instances of wartime violence that gives us numbers that clearly show that only 2.5 million of Jews died in camps, and something like 60% died under different circumstances, then we can count 3.5 million of other civilians dead during the war. So it's a large number of deaths that are less visualized than those connected with death camps, which definitely overshadow our visual culture and memory practices that we develop today. So to sum up this new interest in margins of genocide, ditches, pits, wood clearings, and interest in the centered set of events results in rebuilding the European memorial culture of the periods 39-45, and definitely the dominant spatial symbol of the Holocaust, the death camp, is no longer the only option to be considered. So what I would be doing in the next few minutes is showing the instances of research I spotted that directed the attention of historians and art historians elsewhere, looking for different form of images. So what I will be doing is asking if it is possible to extend our methods and way of carrying out research to include into the visual field more instances of images, and probably also to tune our methods to include those new objects into visual analysis. Because why it is important to look for those omitted images or overlooked images is that because if we don't do that, certain fields of certain part of visual field will be filled only or solely by the images done by perpetrators who had access to visual instruments of documentation, unlike the victims, who definitely are of larger importance in this situation. So since the East Einsatzgruppen in 1942 obliterated entire communities in few days or even mere hours, the potential witness might have had very little time to react visually, unlike the victims who created visual documents under prolonged circumstances of entrapment in concentration camps, in ghettos, or while in hiding on the Aryan side. In a similar situation would be prisoners of transit camps or police prisons, interrogative camps, who spent little time in the places of confinement and could not successfully organize the resistance practices under temporary circumstances. So it is safe to assume that traditionally valued grand genres of visual practices like painting and sculptures will not to be found under such conditions. Hypothetically, what can be traced would be the witnessing done in extremis, as Jacek Leociak once termed it, research into forms of unusual forms of visual testimony constructed under pressure of time, violence, and lack of documenting materials could reveal, for instance, cut on trees, dropped pieces of paper, sketches, maps, or notes, marks on walls or stones. In what will follow, I would like to present few examples of such works, and I will claim need more attention and deserve re-evaluation of their status, while their artistic value might be, of course, questionable. Their visual character is apparent, hence they may become subject of visual studies. Furthermore, their documentary qualities allow for regarding them as important testimonies of the past, and their effective potential repositions them today as powerful stimuli for memorial practices. And my first example would be this. This is a research done in France and a part of publication, The Graffiti du Camp de Drancy, Le Nom sur le Mur, collected by Mélanie Credy, Denis Peshansky, Thierry Zimmer, and under Benoît Poivreau supervision. This presents short-time wall inscriptions found in a Cité de la Muette in Drancy. So this was a temporary camp erected in the time of war. Almost 90% of French Jews came through this camp, being sent to the east. Now this is part of Paris Shoah Memorial. In 2009, it has been reconstructed, and in this time, new inscriptions on the walls of these buildings were found. They were discovered, they were documented, and now in the form of digital documents, they are passed to several research institutes. Similar documents could be found also in Poland. This is part of my research done in Pomiechówek. This is part of the Modlin fortress, so not far away from here. This is still not researched enough and not documented. In this fortress, a temporary camp, detention center, staffed by Polish Volksdeutsche, and after the war being kept still under military supervision. So visitors and researchers were not allowed into this fort. In the inner centers, in inner caverns, there are quite many instances of inscriptions done by prisoners. Another research recently published by Polish archaeologist is a project done called by them Tree Memories, and it is a research done in Hycina village, where some of the bunkers of the German Festung from Oder-Wartebogen were located. And during the final stages of the Second World War, a trench was dug in a woodland near this village, probably by prisoners of war. There are very few documents in text about this event. However, there are documents on the trees that could witness the events. The workers left the random carvings and notes, and recently these surprising documents focused the attention of archaeologists. That was documented and 3D scanned, so we have a better approach to these relics. So the researchers planned to, quote, show how carvings on the bark of trees, in essence, the materiality of the trees, can tell stories that would otherwise be unknown, unquote. While their larger scale strategy was to build alternative approaches allowing for study of events that did not leave behind material culture, but still archaeologically approachable. This new approach would be developed through appreciation, as they say, self-evident or considered too trivial, hence overlooked data. The authors of the research project in Hycina call the phenomenon they construct and study tree memories. Another project recently completed is a presentation of sketches from Reinhard actions by Józef Richter. It's an action, he documented Operation Entefest from 1943 in the eastern part of today's Poland, and 18 surprising pencil drawings that remained from this time. The sketches were found after the war by Miriam Nowicz on the farm in Chełm near Sobibor, and are owned today by Ghetto Fighters House Museum in Israel. In November, so just this exhibition has been opened November 4th, I think, at the Majdanek State Museum. And the exhibition shows the drawings and reveals the results of the investigation into the identity of Józef Richter, who is actually not known. This identity is still not known. However, an interesting information came to me just yesterday that happily, by some miraculous coincidence, exactly during the time of the exhibition. So for the opening of the exhibition, the identity of the author of the person who drew these images was not known. It did not happen to be established. However, it happened like yesterday that one of the researchers came across a document that proved that this person was a Jew hiding on an Aryan side. So these 18 images drawn are on random pieces of paper and pieces of newspapers from the past, or on a non-German announcement to Polish citizens. They usually have also written in Polish in pencil notes on the back or on the bottom of the image. So I would like to now try to conceptualize these instances, these strange images, as a useful tool to approach past, to approach memory, and to work with them in the manner that probably memory studies could accept. So I came across this theory, this useful term, how to generalize this phenomenon of those strange half pictures in the text of James Elkins, who proposed this idea of hobbled pictures. And of course, what he meant in this quote, you could definitely see that he thought mostly of images connected with numbers, with sketches, with this technical language of charts. He says most images are not art. He advocated to draw conclusions from the fact that there is another group of images that has neither religious nor artistic purpose, and that images principally indeed, images principally indeed in the dry language of communication theory to convey information. There is no good name for such images, which include graphs, charts, maps, geometric configuration, notations, plans, official documents, some money, bonds, seals and stamps, astronomical and astrological charts, technical and engineering drawings, scientific images of all sorts, schemata and pictographic or ideographic elements in writing. In other words, the sum total of visual images that are not obviously either artworks or religious artifacts in general. Art history has not studied such images, and at first they are intrinsically less interesting than paintings. They seem like half pictures or hobbled versions of full pictures bound by the necessity of performing some utilitarian function and therefore unable to convey more freely. Their affinity with writing and numbers seems to indicate that they are incapable of the expressive eloquence that is associated with painting and drawing. So while Elkins addresses here mostly what might be included into technical scientific imagery, this idea allows, I think, for a broader gesture of inclusion of all sketched, temporary, unfinished, unprofessional, too trivial images as valid for studies on representations of the past. I would put here an additional emphasis. Such hobbled pictures can offer a researcher a unique insight into historical events. Precisely among those images, utilitarian objects close to writing and numbers, a researcher may find visual objects she needs to fill in visual field of the dissented Holocaust and other underrepresented historical events. So, while Elkins suspected the hobbled pictures to be devoid of affective faculties, being incapable of the expressive eloquence, as he said, I would claim otherwise. The realm of poor half images is intensively expressive and eloquent. As Ernst van Alphen claimed in his article Affective Operations of Art and Literature, visual images, understood broadly in the spirit of the pictorial turn, not only function as providers of content or messages, but also are indispensable in raising feelings and working through them. When images function in this way, they are active agents transmitting affects to the viewer or reader. Images are able to do this because they possess a concreteness that knowledge or propositional content do not have, unquote. Concreteness of hobbled half images is one of, and especially I would stress, emotional and telling character. All the above examples allow to get closer to the experience of the victims who died in the who did the images. To sense or observe the traces of haste, fear, fatigue, one can notice when the hand creating an inscription was unstable, guess the pressure it applied, its care and commitment, the patience or hurry, or the person sketching or tearing the paper. Finally, deduct his or her emotional state, recognizing tension or terror. This extra semantic message embedded into materiality of studied objects transforms these visual documents in objects not only empirical and things not entirely practical, full of features re-invoking past as felt presence. In the instances presented above, the testimonial value is produced evidently not only by human faculty. The materiality of used objects contribute to the message. Björnar Olsson and Christopher Whitmore address this in the following way, quote, The memories that things hold should not be conflated with the conscious and willful faculty of human recollection. Rather, what is crucial here is isomorphic mnemonics, their capacity for bringing the very particular aspect of their own pastness to us. In addition, this often involves a care for their ineffable, for that which escapes historical consciousness, for that which is regarded as too trivial, self-evident, or even too embarrassing to be spoken or written about. Susan Shupley, a British artist and scholar, member of the forensics group, shares the above belief, proposing a theory of material witness. This new operative concept defines an entity, object, or unit whose physical properties or technical configuration records evidence of passing events to which it can be a witness. For instance, the exposure of celluloid film to atmospheric radiation at Chernobyl that can be observed in the Vladimir Shevchenko document from 26 April 1986, in the document called Chernobyl, A Chronicle of Difficult Weeks, is a representation of an event, for sure, in which history is encoded at those junctures of ontological intensity, as Shupley writes, and Shupley comments on cases when material objects are part of external processes that result in their structural reordering. This approach allows to interpret objects presented above, walls, trees, scraps of German announcements, and torn newspapers, as agents producing knowledge of past events. What is more, this hobbled, damaged materiality of images is a way into past events, into a testimonial situation. As Annette Wiewiórka proved in her well-known 1998 L'Ère du Témoin, the witness is a bearer of an experience that, albeit unique, does not exist on its own, but only in the testimonial situation in which it takes place. The formed materiality, I would claim, of half images supplements historical research with an insight into affects of the witness and more broadly, context of the testimony, becoming a rich source of material and historical analysis. And to wrap up, in the last object I'm studying, and I'm in a process of getting more information of this, the author of this pictures is still alive, being 93 and living in Israel. And this is a drawing that is in the holdings of Jewish Historical Institute, and this is a stunning sketch. Jakub Guterman draws on a small yellowish fish of the pre-war transport department of the Warsaw municipality, a scene of mass shootings, extremely rare document of this dispersed Holocaust by Einsatzgruppen. It is an extremely rare depiction of this type of genocidal act done by a representative of a victim group. It is obvious that executions are represented mostly by perpetrators or bystanders. And not to talk more, tell more about the story of Guterman, I would like to propose one more step into this expanding or tuning our attention to those half pictures or damaged pictures, thinking about their precursory or unfinished condition or characteristics. So all the cases presented above share characteristic of something preliminary, provisional, precursory. It might be argued that all the examples in questions are somehow minor, in a sense of lesser importance, unreadiness, as well as underdevelopment or immaturity. These are in fact numerous pictorial testimonies by children, despite the fact that children's drawings were often collected and documented to document Nazi crimes. For instance, there is a beautiful document from the 40s. It consists of almost 4,000 drawings by Polish children. It's in the holdings of National Archives. There is a small publication on that, The War Through the Child Eyes, published in 1983. There have been these children documents have not been studied as historical documents proper. The editors of the collection mentioned above wrote, quote, "The works are a one-in-the-kind testimony of tragic truth of the events. They evoke emotions that need to be remembered,"
unquote. Recently, however, another member of Goldsmith Forensics Group, a researcher, Hanna Mescharos-Martin, an artist and a writer, proposed an analysis of environmental violence in the context of armed conflict in Colombia, developing a method of interpreting images made by children in conflict zones as, quote, a form of forensic drawings, not emotional pictures, narrating the evolution of violence as it has been visually manifested in their life works. So children's sketches, in her view and her approach, are not only testimonies to terror, so they work not only on the affective level, but a thorough study of recurring tropes and forms allowed to read these images as factual documents. So to sum up, do I have 1 minute? Yeah, still? Half, it's exactly perfect what I need. To sum up, the acts of violence that happened too quickly to allow victims to register their fate do leave visual records done by the targeted population. These documents are but sketchy, hasty, provisional, non-artistic, materially deficient. Visual culture studies offer methods to interpret these images as fully relevant. Affective turn allows to draw conclusions from their affective load. Forensic turn focuses our attention to their materiality as being itself of a documentary value. It also allows to dismiss objections toward unprofessionality or immaturity of those depictions. All in all, these hobbled images today, thanks to new methodological developments, turn into important, I would claim, pseudo-forensic data and allowed to fill in blank spaces in the continuum of visual field representing genocidal past. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now I'm going to invite Katja Bernhardt to provide us with comments. And Katja is a research fellow at the Department of Art and Visual History at the Humboldt University in Berlin. And she studied art history and history in Greifswald, Berlin, and Poznan. And she holds a PhD in art history based on a doctoral thesis about the interconnection of architectural theory, politics, and education of architects in Gdańsk, Danzig in the first half of the 20th century.
So, good evening, and I thank you very much that you have the attention for another 10 minutes. The paper presented by our 4 speakers dealt with very different subjects and also proposed and applied an equally wide variety of approaches to analyze them. The vase painting of the Greeks discussed by Tatiana Tereshchenko presented a methodological interpretation of history. The visualizations and differentiations of the other, Scythians, Persians, Egyptians, and Black Africans, were presented to us as a visible structure employed by the Greeks to present their relationship with the nations, with the nations and the world around them. This may well have come about in response to dominastic political demands. By contrast, Justyna Balisz-Schmelz presented a highly subjective examination of the present in a post-war divided Germany. She put forward Baselitz's so-called heroes as the antithesis of the concept of the new man promulgated under National Socialism and Communism. And she suggested that the traumatic disembodiment which were caused by war and the collapse of normative values was articulated in an artistic form. In this analysis, history is an unresolved present, and painting a means of expressing this inner conflict, to my mind. Dorota Kownacka then introduced to us the idea of the writer Kuno Raeber, through whose eyes we looked at the graphics of Karl Rössing. Raeber's historical philosophical insight that all perception is temporal and thus changeable was combined with the conviction that there is a consistency in the materiality of the world, which, regardless of human articulation, maintains a continuum. So I hope I understood it more or less in the right way. The objects in Rössing graphics appears in this manner reduced to their materiality and are thus to some extent present to us as an abrogation of historicity. Reflection on materiality was addressed by Roma Sendyka too. However, instead of the continuum beyond history, she spoke about the concrete historical moment and its persistence in a form determined by the material. Furthermore, she dealt with the specifics of visual articulation conditioned by war and the living conditions of prisoners, deportees, and victims of torture. Rather than concentrating on the reflection of his history in the objects, she underlined their testimony and criticized our perception of history. We hence have faced very different articulations. They range from affective actions under conditions of war and imprisonment to highly artificial drawings on vases to be considered in a specific context of use, from subjective examinations of the present in the form of a series of autonomous paintings to historical and philosophical reflection about art. The only thing the discussed objects seem to have in common is a direct or indirect reference to war. However, allow me to put this aspect to one side for the time being. Instead, the diversity of the themes and the subjects prompts a brief methodological reflection. All the more so given in the name of the panel and its aim as formulated in the call for papers. According to the call for papers, it was planned, quote, to discuss various artistic endeavors in Central and Eastern Europe that focus on issues of history and identity and also have memory as an artistic component of their theme. Are the subjects dealt by the speakers on the panel to be subsumed under art? If not, what should we do with them with respect to the above-mentioned goal? And if they are, what do we gain by regarding them as explicitly artistically designed objects in relation to the topic of the conference? No, of course, I don't want to put a definition of art up for discussion, which would probably nevertheless necessary before answering the question asked. And yes, the question formulated in this way are indeed meant to be a little bit provocative. They are an expression of the impatience that crept up on me in preparation for the commentary. The paper, the diversity of the subjects addressed, and above all, the objects presented within the papers gave an idea, an anticipation of a potential findings. However, it seems to me they can only be exploited by sharpening the analysis, and I would like to make one point in this direction. To illustrate a key point of my criticism with an example. The artifacts presented in the last paper, which were really astonishing for me, the objects I saw, I had the chance to see them before, in the last paper are, in my opinion, not hobbled images or preliminary or provisional or precursory images, but full-fledged images. They must be understood as such and be determined in their specific quality as image, in their really specific quality as images. Only then we will be able to identify the potential knowledge contained in them. I would therefore like to rephrase my question in a more general and hopefully in a more operational, this is a very difficult word for me, operationalize, make it able for operation. So, what kind of pictures are we dealing with? What can we? What do we want to find out from them? What is their specific quality as image, or more generally as visual artifacts to history and memory? These questions are initially directed at a debate about the object's status. One area of significance is the angle from which we consider it with a certain interest of knowledge. So the main aim is to clarify the meaning of image as such in its respective form, in its respective time, and we can add in its respective place. Depending on time and place, it might include the question of whether the image or the object was perceived as a work of art in its time, and whether a certain value was attributed to it in this sense. The question of status of the image leads back to the question of the function of the image and the visual artifacts, and thus to the topic of the conference. To put it more specifically, using one example presented. What was the status of the illustration on vases in the pictorial world of Greeks? Which specific role did they play in this pictorial hierarchy? Do we know anything about practice with which the vases were placed in a functional context? How were the methodologically interpreted conception of history and the evidently associated concepts of order appropriated and memorized by actions, by real actions? In this context, it is important to distinguish not only between significant historical periods and object forms as vases, for instance, but also between concrete historical situations. Under conditions of war and imprisonment, a hurriedly drawn sketch on a newspaper margin can be assumed to have a different status for that of a sketch produced a few months beforehand, maybe by the same or maybe by a different person in freedom, on a similar scrap of paper. How did the world of images change under conditions of war and captivity? The drawings shown are conscious pictorial compositions. They indicate that they were more than simply testimony. So what was the function of the pure act of drawing or scratching in mortar in that case? What function did visual articulation itself have? What task was assigned to the resulting visual testimony? And so I'm sure any certain answer we find are likely to be few and far between. But certainly they are not objects which can simply fill a void in visual transmission. Instead, to keep the last examples, instead both the sketches and also Baselitz's so-called heroes appear to be a medium in which the experience of the present has been transformed, this is the point I want to make, has been transformed into a visually articulated memory. In any case, the act of drawing, painting, even scratching is a process of distancing. In the visual thus produced, remembrance is encountered as subjective interpretation. By reflecting on it, we objectify, and we should objectify, this concrete moment of remembrance in a work and make it an object of historical analysis. The same applies to Raeber. His philosophy of history offers us, for the time being, interpretive access to Rössinger's work, In a second step, Rebenner's concept has itself to become the object of historical analysis. Here, and so I come to an end, here I would like to come back to the focus of the panel directed on art, and so back to my questions. The status of the image in its particular time, or at least the attempt to determine it, will provide clues as to whether and to what extent it might be regarded as an explicitly artistic reflection. In other words, the extent to which the image itself is reflected in a status as a work of art and such is attributed a certain function within the examination of the present remembrance and history. Thus, we gain an additional level, an additional perspective of analysis. We can look for the internal artistic levels of reference, such as pictorial conventions, styles, form as means of reflection, interpretation, and the arrangement of remembrance. We can ask whether the artist assigns themselves a specific status or a specific role in historical interpretation. We heard about Matejko. To name only some analytical approaches we can make of use when asking for specific artistic reflection and endeavors that focusing on remembrance. I don't want to elaborate on that because the main point I wanted to make is, the main point I wanted to make with my short commentary is that we have not only to analyze the image in depth independently, and I underline it independently, whether it is acclaimed or perceived as art or not, but we have to grasp the different layers of memory entailed in the images or the visual artifacts and its usage. But if we want to grasp the different layers of memories entailed in images or visual artifacts and its usage, we have to analyze the role images in general and the object discussed in especially played as specific medium of intentional or affective expression of experience and memory. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it's a very good beginning for discussion. Do we have any questions? Should I pass? Oh, okay, now we have.
I agreed with some of what was said about pushing back against the notion of the hobbled image, but I also want to push back against the pushback, because it seemed to me one of the advantages or the affordances of the hobbled image is that it performs its own inadequacy as a means of representation, and not as an absolute block on knowledge or understanding, but as a relatively banal or pragmatic problem. And that in turn can motivate a more active spectatorship. And so I wondered if either the commentator or the original author here would like to say a bit more about what the hobbled image could do in that regard as a means of remembrance.
So I would like to thank you for the comment and for the question. And to start with the answer, I would like to remind that actually in the title there were distancing marks, quotation marks. So both myself and Elkins use the hobbled image as a term that you need to be aware, it's kind of a proposal that actually is needs this distance from its users. So both myself and he uses this in quotation marks, but what is distinctive about Hobbled image is how Elkins proposes to understand it is this utilitarian function, so this need to convey information. And the instances I showed actually had, all of those instances had this quality to pass names, data, information. So they were not autotelic. They were directly created to fulfill this utilitarian function. Therefore, in this, of course, we could see this moment of making it less artistic, but more documentary. But exactly in this quality, I think, lies this intersection. We need to study those objects as potent, powerful objects telling us something about events that could not leave any other documents because of the brevity, because of the circumstances. So I would claim this group I tried to define as slightly steering a bit off of what Elkins proposed. As I mentioned, he described these Hobbled images as mostly graphs and mathematical or post-mathematical document visualizations. So I would say this is kind of a realm of an overlooked or two less valued objects that actually gives us through materiality and the content some inroad into events that were overlooked or not documentalized enough. And I do agree that to actually enter what happened, you need to treat these objects seriously. So not as some sketches, but as you know, to use as many tools as we have already developed through in art history or visual culture to actually approach it with seriousness to get as much information as possible. But I do think that aesthetic evaluation is, of course, not that what we need and what we are looking for. It's only a road towards something that is helping us to answer more pressing questions we definitely have approaching such objects, meaning what you mentioned, affects, memory, events, terror, etc., etc. So this affective turn definitely helps us to approach it, and these new developments in materiality, of course, Didier Bermond mentioned by my colleagues, made us look into these different materialities of different representations with seriousness. And what I'm proposing here is actually close to this gesture, and it's probably not surprising to the listeners in this room.
The question is what information we gain when we look at these objects, pictures, objects, scratches. And we should be very attentive not to project our expectations on these objects. So we have to be very clearly analyze these objects to ask, what do we really see, and what we can take out of this, what we are seeing. If a scratch, for instance, maybe is not a clear line, but it's like not a clear line. So let's say that we have to be very attentive and not to say, okay, it's a kind of, or it's a testimony that the person was under pressure or something like that. So what I want to ask, what I want to underline is that we have to clearly to ask, what really do we see? So that's the first point. And because we don't get information directly, these are interpretations in some way. They are using even, for instance, let's say the trees, the scratching into the trees. What are they doing? They are using, of course, we can't read them exactly. We don't know exactly what was written there. That's one point. So I have great doubt about the opportunity to get out of them really real information, facts. So I'm really doubt about that. Furthermore, they are using something. They are using a kind of, we know it from other examples. We know trees in which were something written also, or even old buildings and scratches were made, I were here, and so on and so. This is a kind, they are, even in this situation, they are reflecting a kind of culture. So they are applying something they have learned earlier, and they're applying it to their situation, maybe for making testimony. Of course, I'm totally with you that it might be one layer of that. It's only one example. Or taking the very astonishing and sketches you have shown us. What we can do, we can really we can name then images and analyze them with all the opportunities we have to do that. Art history has a very wide range to approach to images and to bring out information from the images which are not facts, but maybe tell us something more about the person who is behind that. So it's really interesting to look at these pictures and to ask where really, how is the person, for instance, who is drawing, is situating himself in the picture. So there we get a very interesting information, but these are not facts. This is rather, they are on the layer of reflecting the situation. The person who draws there, or has drawn there the pictures, was really deeply, to my mind, reflecting about the situation. And this we can get out, but to do so, we really have to analyze the picture and be very, very attentive.
Can I answer to that? May I? Well, I would oppose. Thank you for this heated debate. It's extremely nice to really feel like. Called in front and answering really difficult questions. So this is a challenge. So I would say that I would disagree. We can read the inscriptions. This is what the archaeologists did. So they are readable. So what you can get, these are names and dates, which is an important document. So it's not only a personal statement. It can be treated. It gives you factual information. Another thing is what I stressed in the final part of my talk, this method that forensic archaeology did or proposed in London the last few years, what Hanna Meszaros proved, actually those pictures that you could analyze as personal statement and only personal statement in what is repeatable, actually proved to the historians what atrocity was, what kind of atrocity was done to the local community. So they conveyed this forensic information and were used in the courts of court accusation as proofs. So actually, this is what I propose, how to read those documents, not only as personal statement of terror or not terror. And actually, to my mind, if you see that the carving is, trembling, why not to read it effectively? So why not? So what? It's your decision or mine, but both are completely arbitrary. So
no, it's not a decision. We can only say what we see. We can't to say a hand was trembling is a projection of our I even would say, really, I would say it expectation. It can be. I don't exclude it. It can be, but we should keep it open. Was it or was it not? So then we don't have real information about that. Then we should keep it open. And the other point is that's interesting. If it's possible to link concrete situations and facts with the, let's say, representation in the image. This is okay. If it's possible, so then we have two things bringing together and bringing an information, or giving us an idea of the event in a form of an image. But the image is more than this. To reduce it to these facts is to reduce the potential the image had in the moment when it was drawn, and the potential which lies into, for us, there are more informations for us in this image than only these facts. And this is what I wanted to underline, and therefore we need them to treat them as real images and to approach them with all the opportunities we do have.
Fully agree with that, yeah.
No, I just wanted to say that perhaps, can you hear me? That perhaps the problem is with art history, not with these objects. I mean, art history is like light years behind these objects. And I think that they are a challenge to art history. And art history, as Roma put it very nicely, should serve these objects with its, analytical procedures, dense description, etc., etc. And I also, I know that the notion of fact is, criticized roughly. But there's something about this object that make you think they are material facts, not traces. They're material facts. Before thinking, or perhaps they are thinking, yes? But in the situation where thinking or reflection is just not possible because there is no time for reflection. There's no time for memory. So that was something I just wanted to add to the discussion. Questions?
Hello, I want to ask Justyna, and my question is about the image of the man. A famous Russian religious philosopher Nikolai Berdyaev wrote about the art of Picasso, that this art is not the beginning of something new, but the last page of the old art in the Europe. Of course, it's a point of view, but in this case, could you say the attempt of Baselitz was the attempt to make counter-image to the fascist and socialist body, or to attempt to create a new image of the man? There is some difference between counter-image and between a new man. What do you think about this? Thank you.
I think that he only wanted to depict in these pictures that the old image of a man is no more relevant, yes? We cannot trust these old images, yes? And I think that it is the moment of the disintegration, that the old has passed, and there is nothing that can, there is a moment of transition, yes, between these two images. and there has to be created something new from the rubble. So yes, this I wanted to say that these are the images on the verge of the disintegration. Yes.
Very much. Just one short notice or mention to your mention. You told us that the art history is years behind these objects. Of course, I can agree, but I would like to say that in humanities, every kind of research is years behind every object of its reflection. So it's not a problem of art history, but the humanities in general. That's only one thing I would like to say. Thanks a lot.
No more questions? Do I see? Maybe, no. No, it's a cameraman. I thought he's asking. Well, I think we're gonna say thank you. Thank you very much again, and thank you for the wealth of ideas and very stimulating papers. We have a lot to think about, and see you tomorrow. Thank you very much.